Hello, and welcome to another Fantasy Premier League video. My name is Steve, and with the end of the international break in sight and 3 game weeks under our belts, I thought it would be a good time to check in on the competitive template. Now, you might be sitting there wondering what the competitive template is. Well, it's a new name as part of a list of rank tiers that I have created in order to help new players distinguish how they're faring against the pack. Now, the competitive rank tier is roughly the top 2.5% of all players in the game, or roughly around the top 250k in the world. So we'll take a quick look at the top 250k template, or the competitive template, which you can see on screen now. We'll have a quick look into the top differentials of the top 250k and the low owned. We might have a quick look in at the low owned rank gambles. We'll also check in on what I'm doing with my team heading into game week 4. But before we jump into it, remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, especially if you get any value out of the following content. And as always, I've put the various timestamps below so that you can jump through to the sections that interest you the most. Right, the competitive template, which we've got on screen. So I'll point out a couple of notes on how this is pulled together. So there are no restrictions on budget here. It's simply using ownership levels to show the most commonly owned players in the various rank tiers. In this case, we're looking at the approximate top 250k, or roughly top 2.5% of all players in the game. Now, I should also mention that there are more rank tiers than just the competitive tier. But given that we're only 3 game weeks in, the higher echelons of overall rank don't really change too much in terms of the players or assets that are in the templates. It's mostly around ownership levels. Now you can see the list of rank tiers in the top right hand corner up here. We've got the top rank tier, which is the Premier rank tier, which is just the top 20 players in the world. And it goes all the way down to competitive, which is your top 250k, or roughly top 2.5% of all players. And of course, below that, there is a global rank tier, which is basically just all the players in the game. So for each rank tier, there's actually 3 separate teams that can be viewed. You've got the template team, which is denoted by the shield icon up here, which you can also see next to the players' names. So I've still got a little bit of UI design work to do, but basically the shield icon here just shows next to the name to indicate that we are looking at the template players. You've also got the differentials, which is your ninja icon over here, which we'll have a look at in a minute, which is the second most owned team for that rank tier. And then you've also got the dice icon, which is your low owned or risky gambles, which is your third set of players for that rank tier. So what I've got on screen is the competitive template, and we'll just go through it relatively quickly. There's not a hell of a lot of surprises in here, as we would expect. Most of the players that have been scoring well are in this template because players that score well help managers get up to the top 250k. This will probably be a little bit more insightful as we get deeper into the season. So the total team value of the most owned players in the top 250k is Raya in net, owned by 31% of the top 250k. You've got Pedro Porro Alexander-Arnold and Robinson as your three most owned defenders. So Porro at 42%, Trent at 40%, and Robinson at 32%, with your next two most owned defenders being Saliba at 28%, so he's on the bench, and Gvardiol at 26.5% on the bench. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that players who own these players are putting Saliba or Gvardiol on the bench. They are simply on the bench because three defenders on screen are more owned than both Saliba and Gvardiol. So this tool will organize the team into a valid formation. This one has come out as a 3-4-3 because, as you can see here, the least owned midfielder of Eze at 29% is still higher than Saliba at 28.8%. So if Saliba was slightly higher, this would have shown a 4-3-3. But anyway, in the midfield, we've got Mohamed Salah at 69.9% ownership in the top 250k. Next is actually Emile Smith-Rowe at Fulham. You actually have there's a couple of Fulham players in. We've got Robinson and Smith-Rowe. There's actually a lot of teams out there that are already tripled up on Fulham. We have Rodgers from Aston Villa with a great set of fixtures coming up. Super low owned. He's 5.1%, 5.1 million, owned by 29%. But as you can see in this template, we have both Haaland and Salah. So it is a Haaland-Salah draft. Does also have Isak still in the top 250k. And so in order to fit these players in, you do need a couple of 5.1, 5.7, 5.6 million type players in order to fit your budget. So you've got Rodgers. Eze is still there, even though he's dropped in value down to 6.9 million. He did score last week, came away with 10 points, and he's got a couple of, well, three pretty nice fixtures from an attacking standpoint. Leicester, Man United, and Everton. Up front, we've got Haaland at 85% owned in the top 250k. Not many surprises there. Alexander Isak, still owned by 51% of the top 250k, and then João Pedro rounding out the most owned starters, or the top 11 most owned players in the top 250k in a valid FPL formation. And then on the bench, we have Turner, Saliba, Winks, and Gvardiol. So that's the template team, which is the highest owned players. Now, if we go in and have a look at the popular differentials, you'll see the ownership levels obviously will be all less than the template owners. So the least owned player here is that Harry Winks. So it's Turner at 24%, Winks at 27%, Pedro at 35%, and Gvardiol at 26.5% for the various positions within our team. And if you go to, the site's running a little bit slow today, the competitive differentials, you've got Henderson in net with Fabianski as the backup keeper. You've then got some very common dead ringers on the bench. So Barco, 4 million, still owned by 24.5% of the top 250k. Harwood Bellis, another 4 million. Faze, another 4 million. And Dan Burn, who's done his knee, I think, again, at 4.5 coming in. So as you can see, the differential players are typically the ones that are kind of filling out the spots on the bench. Across the midfield, we've got Saka at 27%, Diogo Jota 23%, Palmer 21%, Gordon 20%, Luis Diaz 17%, and then Chris Wood was actually the fourth most owned forward in the top 250k, coming in at 19%. And then the bench rings out with Konza, Havertz up front, and Muniz up front. So we won't go through the low owned list of players because these will change a bit, but what I really wanted to show you is how the template, because we are only 3 game weeks in, doesn't really change a hell of a lot when we look at the different rank tiers. So this is the top 250k competitive rank tier, template players most owned. If we switch across to, say, the legendary rank tier, which is actually the top 5k of players, or the top 0.05% of the game, you'll see that the team doesn't actually change a hell of a lot. Pretty much all the players remained stagnant, apart from Luis Diaz, who now pops in. So if we go back to competitive, Luis Diaz isn't here. He's actually in the differentials as the least owned midfielder out of all the differentials. So in the second most owned team of the top 250k, he is the least owned of the midfielders. But in the top 5k of players, he's actually the 4th most owned. We're in differentials. Let's switch back to the template. He's actually, sorry, the 3rd most owned midfielder, coming in at 34% ownership in the top 5k. And again, this isn't too surprising. Luis Diaz has actually been banging goals in recently. He's currently 2nd in the Golden Boot race. And if we take a quick look at his season stats over here, he's picked up 3 starts, 3 clean sheets, 226 minutes, 3 goals scored, which is 2nd overall for the top most goals. I mean, Haaland's banging it out with 7, so he's a bit behind Haaland at the moment. 1 assist, 5 bonus points, and obviously you would expect to see the low-owned players that have been scoring really well in the template team of the higher echelon. So these kinds of things, I mean, you could probably guess most of this about 3 game weeks into the season, because there's not too many combinations of players that would have helped you get up to the top 5k in the world. All right. So that's a very quick look at the competitive template. Now, what I'll also quickly show you before we jump into my team is the top transfers in this game week. So this is actually nothing to do with the rank tiers. So even though we do still have the competitive rank tier selected here, the competitive rank tier here will show, will limit the ownership levels to that rank tier's ownership levels. So all these ownership levels that you see in here will still be the ownership levels relevant to the top 250k. But all this is showing is the most bought players this game week, so heading into game week 4, across the whole game. So most bought goalkeeper, Fabianski, bought by 172k net positive transfers in. So this is the difference between transfers in minus transfers out. Next, across the defensive line, most bought defensive player is Rico Lewis at 432k. Robinson, 235k. Dean, which is quite surprising, because he is a little bit of a troll in the FPL community, but Aston Villa do have a very nice set of fixtures coming up. He's been bought by 215,000 managers, only owned by 3.4% of the top 250k. Keane has been bought by 207,000 managers, a 4 million asset. I suspect that is because he's got 3 starts, plays in a relatively decent team, even though they're not doing too well defensively, but I suspect he's just going on the bench. Luis Diaz as the most bought midfielder, 674,000 transfers in. I mean, if you score well early on, then you will affect the market quite heavily. I would have suspected that most Salah would have been the most bought player heading into Game Week 4, but he is the second most bought midfielder at 475k. Onana at Aston Villa, 475,000 transfers in. And then the really big transfers in, which is João Pedro, 737,000 managers buying an enabling forward who has been scoring well in the first 3 game weeks. Then Haaland at 575,000 transfers in this game week. And then Danny Welbeck is the third most bought forward, also kindly priced at 5.7 million, but does not come with penalties, but he has been banging in the goals or the points early season. Then you've got Alisson Becker on the bench as the second most owned goalkeeper, coming in for Liverpool's good run. Semenyo, my dark horse from pre-season, who I really wish I had bought in pre-season now, who has been doing extremely well and seems to be topping most of the expected charts at the moment, being purchased by 190,000 managers. Matoma is sneaking in there with 180,000 transfers in, and then Kanate, my replacement last week for Lewis Hall, has been picked up by 167,000 managers across the game, only owned by 1.7% of the competitive template. He's a great blocker to block out those clean sheets of any Trent and Robertson owners out there. And so these are the most bought players, and then we can switch over to the most sold players across the whole game. Still looking at the competitive ownership levels here. Most sold, some of these probably won't come as a surprise. Pickford sold by 123,000. Vardiol, probably not really a surprise that he's being sold quite heavily, 264,000 sales. City are still leaking like a goal a game. I think they've only got 1 clean sheet so far. 6 million is quite an outlay for Guardiola, who isn't getting as far forward with Rico Lewis on the pitch. Barco, I mean, that's probably a pretty obvious sale. I suspect a lot of those are on wildcard, so there's probably a lot of managers out there pulling the wildcard, getting rid of Barco, who's gone out on loan. Anderson, who switched clubs and hasn't yet he's got 1 start, 2 blanks. He's been sold by 173,000. Sort of surprising, I suppose, is Gordon. He's currently in my team. It's already dropped by 0.1 million. Most sold midfielder at the moment of 243,000 sales. He's away to Wolves this week. Chelsea played Wolves a couple of game weeks ago away at Molineux and destroyed them 6-2. I am a little bit surprised that Gordon is the most sold, but he hasn't really been returning so far this season. Foden, who has been injured, but looks like he is now available for Game Week 4. Whether or not he gets on the pitch is another story. Odegaard, who has picked up a knock or an ankle injury. Saka, who's got a couple of tough fixtures, away to Tottenham, away to Man City. And then Alexander Isak up front. He was in the top, one of the most owned in the top 250k, but is the most sold forward, sold by 475,000 managers for Game Week 4. He is probably going to hit a price drop at some point. Then Ollie Watkins, 60-minute man for the first 3 game weeks. I do think Ollie Watkins is going to be playing reduced minutes for an extended period. I think this is in preparation for the UCL and the new format, where they will have to be fielding a lot stronger teams in that league. So I think those are all very wise sales. I don't agree with the Newcastle sales ahead of the Wolves and Fulham fixtures. And then Dominic Solanke, who was injured, looks like he is going to be available for Game Week 4, and then the rest on the bench. And that pretty much rounds out the most sold players for Game Week 4. Right, so we'll switch over to my team and my team selection for Game Week 4. Now, there's actually not a lot to talk about in my team. I am planning to roll the transfer this game week. The only player that has come in with a flag out of the international break is Cole Palmer, who was not included in the Europa Conference League squad at all across the international break. I would have expected to see him in the squad, just not starting, with him potentially coming on in the later stages of that match if he was needed. However, he was also not on international duty, and so the reports coming out from from Matt Law, is apparently quite well connected to Chelsea, is saying about Cole Palmer, I'm confident he's okay. He has muscle fatigue, but they are being sensible with him. Unless he's picked up something between times or since he last saw him, he said, I think he's okay. Now, in that Wolves fixture, which is the fixture that provoked me into buying Cole Palmer, when he did leave the pitch, I think he went off a little bit early, and he was walking down the tunnel holding his hamstring. However, sorry, that was the fixture before the Wolves fixture, but then he went on to play the Wolves fixture, and looked amazing, which is when I decided to bring him in. And he also played the last parts of the Civet match after he went away for some scans on that hamstring, which goes to show that he was still fine enough to play. So it's likely that he's just being rested to reduce the fatigue, and so they've probably opted him out of the international duties, which means you also can't go and play the UECL. So there's actually not much. I mean, Chelsea are building their whole squad seemingly around Palmer, who is currently their best attacker and had an amazing season last season. So it makes sense that if you're a little bit fatigued, that you would opt out of the international friendlies, which would also mean that you will be opted out of the UECL fixture. But I do expect him to get a start in Gameweek 4. However, he might get some reduced minutes. It's very hard to tell how fatigued he was and how much he might have recovered across that break. Now, Palmer wasn't in my thoughts for captaincy this week, but if he was somewhere in the back of my thoughts, I think this would be enough to deter me from captaining him. If he does come off after 75 minutes, that is a bit of a downside to putting the captaincy on him. I'm going to be captaining Haaland this week, Brentford at home. I mean, the only other player that you might potentially think about is Alexander Isak away to Wolves as he comes with pens. I don't think I would risk it on Diogo Jota because he doesn't have pens. It's the last game before the Champions League matches kick off between Gameweek 4 and 5, I believe. And so I am a little bit worried that Diogo Jota might also come off early if he is being prioritized for those the UCL fixtures in midweek. But I'm just going to be banging the captaincy on Haaland. So hopefully we will see a well-rested and fully fit Cole Palmer back on the pitch in Gameweek 4, who is looking bang in form, or looking back to bang in form. However, if we do get a bit of a leggy performance that's accompanied with some sort of blank, as he's already, he isn't being sold too heavily. It's only negative 39k with the flag that went on him. However, if he does blank, Chelsea don't look too good away to Bournemouth. I can see probably a whole bunch of further sales, and that may mean that I might need to jump back on Salah, pulling the plug on the Palmer play, after just 2 short weeks. But that would be because Haaland has got Arsenal next week, and I don't really have another captain that I would like to captain, which might mean that I might be looking to bring in someone like Semenyo as a downgrade of either Gordon or Diogo Jota, depending on how they perform this weekend, in order to fund the moves back up to Salah, which is why I am also rolling the transfer this week, so I can do that for free next week should I need to. And alright, well that wraps up this video. So don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a comment to tell us what you think. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all again next time.